The job posting appeared on my screen at 3:47 a.m., glowing like a beacon in the wasteland of my Indeed search results. $70 an hour, no experience necessary. Night shift. I'd been living in my Honda Civic for 3 weeks since the eviction notice, showering at the gym until my membership expired, surviving on gas station coffee, and the crushing realization that my marketing degree was worth less than the paper it was printed on. My last office job had left me hollow, a shell of a person who'd spent 2 years optimizing click-through rates for products I'd never use, sold to people who didn't need them. So when I saw that listing, night curator needed, must be comfortable with unusual art, I didn't hesitate. I applied immediately, typing my desperate plea into the void at 4 a.m. while parked behind a 24-hour Walmart. The response came within minutes, a simple address and come immediately, ask for Mrs. Holloway. I should have known then that normal employers don't conduct interviews at dawn. The address led me through winding streets I'd never noticed before, despite living in this city for 6 years. The neighborhood felt displaced, like it had been carefully extracted from somewhere much older and quietly inserted between the familiar blocks of condos and coffee shops. Victorian houses with immaculate gardens lined streets that seemed perpetually shaded, even as morning light streamed everywhere else. The gallery sat at the end of Crescent Lane, a building that looked like it had been waiting there long before the city grew around it. 3 stories of dark stone and tall windows, with iron railings that curled like thorny vines. A discreet brass plaque read, "Holloway Private Collection." Mrs. Holloway answered the door before I could knock. She was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 70, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes the color of winter sky. Everything about her suggested old money and older secrets. "You must be the applicant," she said, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Good. You have the right look." The right look? Desperate but not broken, curious but not foolish. She stepped aside, gesturing me into a foyer that smelled of lemon oil and something else. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. The art can sense these things. The interior made my breath catch. Paintings covered every wall, some in elaborate gold frames, others hanging bare on aged canvas. I recognized styles, but not specific works. Here, a piece that whispered of Caravaggio's shadows. There, something that might have been Van Gogh's fever dreams rendered in colors that shouldn't exist. I've been looking for a night curator for some time, Mrs. Holloway continued, leading me deeper into the gallery. Someone to watch over the collection when I'm away. The art requires supervision. What kind of supervision? She paused beside a painting of a dinner party, the figures' faces obscured by shadow despite the chandelier blazing above them. Nothing complicated. Simply follow the rules, and you'll do fine. That should have been my second warning. The tour took an hour. 3 floors, dozens of rooms, hundreds of pieces that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Mrs. Holloway pointed out key works with the casual pride of someone showing off family photos, though I noticed she never actually touched any of the frames. "This is the morning feast," she said, stopping before a large oil painting that showed figures in black gathered around a table laden with what looked like funeral flowers. 16th century, though the artist's name is lost to time. It can be temperamental. The painting seemed ordinary enough, though something about the way the painted figure seemed to lean slightly forward made me uncomfortable. "And here," she continued, moving to a portrait of a man in a dark coat standing beside an empty chair, "is the visitor. 18th century, possibly French. He's quite well behaved, all things considered." The man in the painting had a kind face, though his eyes held a sadness that seemed to follow me as we moved past. We ended the tour in her office, a cluttered space behind the main gallery, filled with ledgers, insurance documents, and what looked like very old correspondence written in languages I couldn't identify. "The position pays $70 an hour," she said, settling behind her desk. 5 nights a week, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. You'll have the building to yourself. What about security alarms? The art takes care of itself. She opened a drawer and withdrew a laminated sheet of paper. These are your instructions. Follow them precisely and you'll have no trouble. I took the sheet, scanning the list with growing bewilderment. Rules for night carrier. Do not break these. 1. Lock the front doors precisely at 10:59 p.m. Never open them until 6 a.m., no matter who knocks. 2. Walk the east wing clockwise every hour, never counterclockwise. 3. If the painting titled The Morning Feast begins dripping red, look away immediately. Do not clean it. 4. At midnight, the man in the oil painting titled The Visitor may step out. Offer him a seat. Do not ask questions. 5. If a painting is missing from the wall, do not search for it. Wait until 4:13. It always returns. 6. Should you hear crying in the sculpture garden, ignore it. The statues crave sympathy. 7. The phone will ring at 2:22. The voice will ask for your name. Never say your real name. 8. If you see a canvas that shows your childhood home, you're being watched from inside the frame. Do not approach. 9. At 5:59 a.m., place the key back in the mouth of the lion bust. Smile. The gallery likes gratitude. Is this some kind of joke? I asked. Mrs. Holloway's expression didn't change. I assure you, it isn't. Do you want the position or not? I looked at the rules again, then at my bank balance on my phone. Negative $43. Then at Mrs. Holloway's patient, expectant face. When do I start? Tonight. My first shift began with the mundane task of locking doors. I turned the heavy deadbolt at exactly 10:59, watching the second hand on my phone tick toward 11 o'clock. The lock engaged with a sound like a coffin closing. The gallery felt different at night. During the day, it had been elegant and eccentric. Now, in the dim glow of carefully placed LED strips, it felt alive. The paintings seemed to breathe, their colors shifting subtly in the low light. Shadows moved where there should have been stillness. I made my first clockwise tour of the East Wing at 11 o'clock, walking past landscapes that seemed to whisper with wind I couldn't feel. Portraits whose eyes tracked my movement with uncomfortable intensity. The morning feast looked ordinary enough. Just figures at a table, no dripping red in sight. By 11:30, I was almost comfortable. This was just an eccentric old woman's paranoid fantasy, I told myself. Rich people had weird hobbies. I could handle weird. The first phone call came at 11:47. I was sitting in the small office Mrs. Holloway had designated as my station, reading one of the art history books she'd left for me, when the antique rotary phone on the desk rang. The sound cut through the gallery's silence like a scream. Holloway Private Collection, I said, lifting the heavy receiver. Silence, then breathing. Hello? I tried again. The boy with the broken bicycle, whispered a voice like autumn leaves. He's crying in the garden. The line went dead. I sat staring at the phone for several minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voice had been thin, androgynous, with an accent I couldn't place. And what it said, I didn't understand the reference, but something about it made my skin crawl. My midnight tour of the East Wing was more nervous than the first. Every shadow seemed to hide movement, every painting seemed to lean forward as I passed. When I reached the visitor, I stopped and stared. The empty chair beside the painted man looked somehow more prominent now, as if someone had just vacated it. The man himself seemed more alert, his painted eyes fixed on mine, with an intensity that made my breath catch. As I watched, his mouth curved into what might have been a smile. I hurried past. At 12:15, I heard footsteps in the main gallery. Slow, measured steps on hardwood floors. The kind of sound expensive leather shoes make. I froze in my chair, listening as the footsteps moved from room to room with obvious familiarity. Someone was in the gallery with me. My first instinct was to call the police, But Mrs. Holloway's rules echoed in my head. Never open the doors until 6 o'clock, no matter who knocks. If someone had broken in, they were trapped inside with me until dawn. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and crept toward the sound, my sneakers making no sound on the floor. The footsteps led me to the main gallery, where I found nothing. The room was empty, exactly as I'd left it, but the chair, the real chair that sat beside the visitor's painting, was now occupied. A man in an 18th century coat sat with perfect posture, his hands folded in his lap. He had the same kind face as the painted figure, the same sad eyes. When he saw me, he nodded politely. "Good evening," he said in accented English. "Might I trouble you for some company? The nights can be quite long." I stood frozen, the flashlight beam wavering in my trembling hand. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this couldn't be happening, that people don't step out of paintings, that I was having some kind of breakdown brought on by stress and card dwelling and too much caffeine. But the rules were clear. Offer him a seat. Of course, I managed, gesturing to the chair he already occupied. "Please, make yourself comfortable." He smiled, and some of the sadness left his eyes. "Thank you. You're very kind." We sat in silence for nearly an hour. He didn't speak again, just sat with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to waiting. Occasionally, he would glance at his painted self on the wall with what looked like mild embarrassment, as if uncomfortable seeing himself displayed. At 1:13, he stood. "Thank you for your company," he said, bowing slightly. "Perhaps we'll speak again tomorrow." He walked to the painting and stepped into it, his form dissolving into oils and canvas until he was once again just pigment arranged in the shape of a man. I spent the next hour writing detailed notes about what I'd seen, trying to convince myself it had actually happened. The alternative, that I was losing my mind, seemed somehow worse than accepting that paintings could walk. The phone rang again at 2:22, precisely as the rules had predicted. "Holloway Private Collection?" I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "What is your name?" the same whispering voice asked again. I opened my mouth to respond automatically, then caught myself. The rules were specific. "Never say your real name." "Smith?" I lied. "John Smith." A pause. Then, "The boy with the broken bicycle remembers differently." The line went dead. I sat staring at the phone, a cold dread spreading through my chest. The boy with the broken bicycle. Why did that phrase feel familiar? Why did it make me want to run screaming from the building? The rest of the night passed without major incident. I made my hourly tours, avoiding looking directly at the morning feast, which seemed to shimmer with moisture around the edges. No paintings went missing. I heard no crying from the sculpture garden, though I pointedly avoided looking out the windows that faced it. At 5:59, I placed the key in the mouth of the lion bust as instructed. The bronze felt warm against my fingers, and I could swear I felt it purr. "Thank you," I whispered, feeling foolish but remembering the rule about gratitude. The lion's eyes seemed to twinkle. Mrs. Holloway arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, looking as composed as if she'd spent the night at a hotel instead of wherever it was she went during my shifts. "How was your first night?" she asked, settling behind her desk with a cup of tea that steamed, despite the fact that I hadn't heard her use the kitchen. "Eventful," I said carefully. "The visitor, he's very polite," she smiled. "He is, isn't he? Did you enjoy his company?" Yes. It was surprisingly pleasant." "Good. The art responds well to kindness." She opened a leather ledger and made a notation with an antique fountain pen. "Any other observations?" I told her about the phone calls, the mysterious voice asking for my name. Her expression grew serious. "And you didn't give it?" "No." I said John Smith. She relaxed. "Very good. That voice has been calling for years. We've never determined its source, but it seems harmless as long as you follow the rules." "What happens if you don't?" "Follow the rules, I mean?" Mrs. Holloway looked up from her ledger, and for a moment her composed mask slipped. What I saw underneath was fear, old, deep, and carefully hidden. "Nothing good," she said simply. "Your shift is over. Go home and rest. I'll see you tonight." The second night started the same way. Lock the doors at 10:59, begin the clockwise tours, avoid looking directly at anything that might be dripping. But the gallery felt different somehow, more aware of my presence, less like a museum and more like a living thing that had accepted me into its ecosystem. The visitor emerged at midnight again, taking his seat with the same polite nod. This time, I was less terrified and more curious. "How long have you been here?" I asked. He considered the question. "Time moves differently within the canvas," he said finally. "Years pass like days, but days can stretch like years. I believe it has been quite some time since I was painted. Do you remember being alive? Before the painting?" A shadow crossed his face. "Sometimes. Fragments. I remember a woman's laugh, the smell of roses, the weight of loss, but the details fade. The paint holds only echoes." We talked quietly for the next hour. He spoke of the other paintings, the peculiar society that existed within the gallery walls. The landscapes dreamed of wind and weather, he told me. The still lifes hungered for the warmth of human hands. The portraits remembered faces of loved ones long dead. "And the morning feast?" I asked. His expression darkened. "Best not to discuss that one. It remembers too much." At 1:13, he returned to his frame as before, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. The phone rang at 2:22. Holloway Private Collection. "The boy with the broken bicycle is looking for you," whispered the voice. "He wants to show you what happened in the woods." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, though my hands were shaking. "The red bicycle with the bent wheel, the path through the pine trees, you remember." But I didn't. Or rather, I did, but the memory felt like something glimpsed through thick glass, distorted and impossible to grasp clearly. "You were 8, the voice continued. "You followed the path. You found the clearing. You saw what was buried there." The line went dead, leaving me in silence that felt heavier than it should have. I tried to push the conversation from my mind, focusing on my duties. Tour the East Wing, check the paintings, ignore the crying from the sculpture garden that I definitely wasn't hearing. But as I walked past the various artworks, I found myself looking for something I couldn't name. My eyes swept the walls, searching for... what? A painting that didn't belong? A canvas that showed something it shouldn't? I found it on my 3 a.m. tour. It was hanging in a small alcove I could have sworn was empty the night before, a modest painting in a simple wooden frame. The canvas showed a small house with blue shutters, a tire swing hanging from an oak tree, and a red bicycle with a noticeably bent front wheel leaning against the porch steps. My childhood home, exactly as I remembered it, down to the crack in the sidewalk and the way the mailbox tilted slightly to the left. But that wasn't what made my blood turn to ice. In the painting, a small figure stood at the edge of the woods beyond the backyard. A boy with dark hair and a striped shirt, barely visible between the pine trees. As I watched, the painted boy raised his hand and waved. I stumbled backward, my heart slamming against my ribs. The rule was clear. If you see a canvas that shows your childhood home, you're being watched from inside the frame. Do not approach. But I couldn't look away. The painted house was perfect in every detail, as if someone had taken a photograph of my memories and translated them into oils. Even the shadows fell correctly, matching the late afternoon light that had always made our backyard feel magical. The boy in the woods waved again, more urgently this time. I wanted to move closer, to see his face clearly, to understand what he wanted to show me. But the rules held me back like physical chains. Instead, I forced myself to continue my rounds, trying to ignore the painting as I passed it on each subsequent tour. But I could feel eyes watching me from within the frame, and slowly, horribly, I began to remember. The bicycle had been a birthday gift, bright red with streamers hanging from the handlebars and a bell that rang like silver laughter. I'd ridden it everywhere that summer, exploring the neighborhood with the fearless confidence that only 8-year-olds possess. The path through the woods had always been there, a narrow trail that wound between the pine trees behind our house. Most kids avoided it, too dark, too quiet, full of the kind of shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. But I'd been curious and bored, and the path had whispered promises of adventure. I'd followed it deeper than I'd ever gone before, my bicycle bumping over roots and rocks, the trees closing in overhead until the afternoon sun was just scattered coins of light on the forest floor. The clearing had opened suddenly, a perfect circle of grass surrounded by ancient pines. In the center was a stone, flat and rectangular, like a table or like a grave marker. I'd dismounted my bike, letting it fall as I approached the stone. There had been words carved into its surface, worn almost smooth by weather and time, but still legible. "Here lies the boy who asked too many questions." That was when I'd heard the crying. Soft at first, like wind through leaves, then louder, more human, the sound of a child sobbing, with the desperate, hopeless grief that only comes from profound loss. I'd looked around the clearing, but seen no one. The crying seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the earth itself was weeping. Then I'd noticed the disturbed ground beside the stone. Fresh earth, darker than the soil around it, and poking through the dirt, small and pale and wrong. Fingers. Child's hand, reaching up from beneath the earth as if trying to claw its way back to the light. I'd run then, crashing through the underbrush, leaving my bicycle behind in my panic. I'd burst into our house screaming about dead children and graves in the woods, but my parents had dismissed it as childhood imagination run wild. When my father had gone to retrieve my bicycle the next day, he'd found it on the path with a bent front wheel, as if something heavy had stepped on it. But he'd seen no clearing, no stone, no disturbed earth. "Just woods," he'd said. "Nothing but trees and your overactive imagination." I'd never spoken of it again. And somehow, over the years, the memory had faded, until it was just another half-remembered childhood nightmare. But now, staring at the painting of my old home with that familiar red bicycle on the porch, it all came flooding back with crystal clarity. The boy in the woods, the boy in the painting, was waving at me with small pale fingers that looked exactly like the hand I'd seen pushing up through the dark earth. I managed to complete my shift without approaching the painting, though it took every ounce of willpower I possessed. When Mrs. Holloway arrived at 6 o'clock, I was waiting by her desk with barely contained desperation. "There's a new painting," I said before she could ask about my night. "My childhood home. It wasn't there before." She set down her tea and studied my face with those winter sky eyes. "The gallery sometimes adds to itself," she said carefully. "Shows us things we need to see. The rules say not to approach it. Why? Because some memories are dangerous. Some doors should remain closed." "But what if the memory is already open? What if I'm starting to remember things I'd forgotten?" Mrs. Holloway was quiet for a long moment. "What exactly are you remembering?" I told her about the bicycle, the path through the woods, the clearing with its stone marker, and the terrible thing I'd found buried there. She listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. "And you never told anyone the specifics?" "My parents didn't believe me, said it was just imagination." "It may have been," she said, but her tone suggested she didn't believe that any more than I did. "The mind of a child can create very vivid fantasies." "Then why is it in your gallery? Why is there a painting of my exact childhood home with that same bent bicycle and a boy in the woods who keeps trying to get my attention?" Mrs. Holloway opened her desk drawer and withdrew a thick folder. "The gallery has a history," she said, spreading photographs and documents across the desk. "Not all of it pleasant." The photos were old, black and white, showing the gallery at different periods, but one caught my attention. A group photo of children standing in front of the building, dated 1987. 23 kids of various ages, all smiling at the camera. All except one. In the back row, a boy with dark hair and a striped shirt stood slightly apart from the others. His face was serious, almost sad, and his eyes seemed to look directly at the camera with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Dollar Art Camp, Mrs. Holloway explained. The gallery used to host programs for local children. This was the last year. What happened? One of the children went missing, a boy named Timothy Chen, 8 years old. The photo trembled in my hands. The boy in the striped shirt looked exactly like the figure I'd seen in the painting, waving from the edge of the woods. They searched for weeks, Mrs. Holloway continued, found his bicycle on a path behind his house, front wheel bent like something had stepped on it. But no other trace. You think he was murdered? I think the gallery remembers things, and sometimes it tries to tell us about them. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. The voice on the phone. It's been talking about a boy with a broken bicycle. Yes, it's him, isn't it? Timothy. Mrs. Holloway nodded slowly. The gallery holds many spirits. Most are content to remain within their frames, living quiet afterlives among the art they've come to love. But Timothy has unfinished business. What kind of business? The kind that involves showing someone what happened in the woods? I spent the day in my car, parked outside the gallery, staring at the building and trying to process what I'd learned. A murdered child. A supernatural gallery. A mysterious employer who spoke of ghosts like they were old friends. Should have quit, should have driven away and never looked back. But $70 an hour was $70 an hour, and despite the increasingly surreal nature of my employment, I found myself oddly attached to the place. The visitors' quiet companionship, Mrs. Holloway's mysterious kindness, even the gallery's strange living presence. It all felt more real than any job I'd ever had. So when evening came, I returned. The painting was waiting for me. It had moved, not to a different wall, but within the frame itself. The perspective had shifted, revealing more of the backyard and the woods beyond, and the boy in the striped shirt was closer now, no longer at the edge of the trees, but halfway across the yard, his hand still raised in that urgent wave. I could see his face clearly now. Asian features, dark eyes full of desperate pleading. Timothy Chen, frozen at 8 years old, trying to communicate across decades of silence. The visitor emerged at midnight as usual, taking his chair with practiced grace. But tonight, he seemed agitated. "You've seen the new edition," he said without preamble. "Timothy's painting." "Yes." "He's not like the rest of us. We chose to remain and found peace within the canvas. Timothy was pulled here by violent death and unfinished business. He's unstable." "What does he want?" The visitor glanced toward the alcove where the painting hung. "To show someone the truth, to have his story told. The dead don't rest easy when their murders go unsolved." "So, someone did kill him?" "Someone buried him in those woods. And that someone is still alive." A chill ran down my spine. "How do you know?" "The gallery knows many things. It remembers every visitor, every story, every secret whispered in its halls. Timothy's killer has walked these floors." At 1:13, the visitor returned to his frame, but not before leaving me with a final warning. "Be careful. Timothy's hunger for justice makes him dangerous. He may try to pull you into the painting, make you see what he saw. If that happens..." "What?" "You may not find your way back." The phone rang at 2:22. "What is your name?" asked the familiar whisper. This time I was ready. "Timothy," I said. "My name is Timothy." A long pause, then, "No, you know my name. I want yours." "I can't tell you that. The boy with the broken bicycle knows it. He's been waiting so long to tell someone what happened, what he saw before the darkness took him." "What did he see?" "The man with the gentle hands and the terrible smile. The man who said he just wanted to help, fix the broken bicycle. The man who led him deeper into the woods than any boy should ever go. My hands were shaking now. Who was he? You'll know when you see the painting. Really see it. The boy is trying to show you his face. The line went dead. I sat in the darkness of the office, my heart pounding. Timothy was trying to show me something. Not just the memory of his death, but the identity of his killer. And somehow, that person was connected to the gallery. But approaching the painting would mean breaking the rules, and breaking the rules meant risking getting pulled into the canvas, trapped forever in Timothy's nightmare. Unless, what if the rules weren't meant to protect me from the painting? What if they were meant to protect the painting from me? I waited until 4 o'clock when the gallery felt deepest in its supernatural sleep. Then, I made my way to the alcove, my flashlight beam playing across the painted surface of my childhood home. Timothy was much closer now, standing just at the edge of the backyard. His mouth was open as if he was calling out, and his eyes were fixed on something beyond the frame, something I couldn't see from my angle. "I know you're trying to tell me something," I whispered to the painting. "I know you want to show me who hurt you, but I can't break the rules. I can't get pulled in." The painted boy's expression seemed to shift, becoming more urgent, more desperate. His small hand pointed toward the woods behind him, then back toward the porch where the red bicycle waited. And then I understood. He wasn't trying to show me what happened in the woods. He was trying to show me who had been at the house before he'd ridden into the woods. Someone who had come to the door, offered to help with the broken bicycle, gained his trust. I looked more carefully at the painted porch, searching for details I'd missed before. The windows were dark, but the front door was slightly ajar. And there, barely visible in the shadows of the doorway, was another figure. A man, tall and thin, with silver hair and a kind face. A face I recognized, Mrs. Holloway. But that was impossible. The painting showed my childhood home, not Timothy's. And the dates didn't match. Timothy had disappeared in 1987, when I was 8 years old. Mrs. Holloway would have been younger then, but still an adult woman. Not the man I could barely make out in the shadows. I leaned closer, trying to see more clearly, when the painted Timothy suddenly looked directly at me. His mouth moved, forming words I could almost hear. "Look closer. Look at the eyes." The man in the doorway stepped forward slightly, just enough for me to see his face more clearly, and with growing horror, I recognized the features. Not Mrs. Holloway's, but someone related to her. Someone with the same winter sky eyes and sharp cheekbones. A son, perhaps, or a husband. "Mr. Holloway," I breathed. The painted Timothy nodded frantically, then pointed again toward the woods. His message was clear. Mr. Holloway had lured him from his house with promises of fixing his bicycle, then led him into the woods, where the painting began to shift and blur, the perspective changing as if I was being pulled closer to the canvas. I stumbled backward, Mrs. Holloway's rules echoing in my head. "Do not approach." But it was too late. The frame was expanding, the painted world growing larger and more real. I could smell pine trees and summer grass, could hear the distant sound of a child crying. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the backyard of my childhood home, the red bicycle gleaming in the afternoon sun. But this wasn't my memory, this was Timothy's, playing out like a movie in which I was an unwilling participant. The front door opened and a man emerged. He was perhaps 40, with prematurely silver hair and Mr. Holloway's distinctive eyes. He smiled at Timothy with genuine warmth, the kind of expression that would put any child at ease. "Hello there," he said in a cultured voice. "I couldn't help but notice your bicycle. The front wheel looks damaged." Timothy looked down at the bent rim, his face falling. "I hit a rock. My dad's going to be mad." "Oh, I don't think so. These things happen." The man approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. the universal gesture of someone who means no harm. You know, I have some tools in my workshop that might fix that right up. Would you like me to take a look? Timothy's face brightened. Really? You could fix it? I'm sure I could. My workshop is just through those woods there. It's not far. The man gestured toward the tree line, and Timothy followed his gaze trustingly. He was just a child, 8 years old, and eager to have his bicycle repaired before his parents discovered the damage. Okay, Timothy said, starting to wheel the bike toward the woods. I wanted to scream, to warn him, to grab him and run. But I was just an observer in this painted memory, powerless to change what had already happened decades ago. They disappeared into the trees together, the trusting child and the man with the gentle smile. And I knew that only one of them would ever come back. The scene began to fade, the colors bleeding away like watercolors in rain. I found myself standing back in the gallery staring at the painting, which now showed only an empty backyard and an abandoned bicycle. Timothy was gone, but his message was clear. Mrs. Holloway's husband, or son or brother, had been a predator, had lured children into the woods with promises of help. Then, I needed to know more. I needed to understand the connection between my childhood home and Timothy's story. And I needed to find out what had happened to Mr. Holloway. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of anxiety and racing thoughts. When Mrs. Holloway arrived at 6 o'clock, I was waiting with barely contained urgency. I need to ask you about your husband, I said before she could sit down. Her teacup rattled against its saucer. My husband? Or son? Or brother? A man with silver hair and your eyes. Someone who lived here in 1987. Mrs. Holloway set down her cup with deliberate precision. What exactly did you see in that painting? Timothy Chen and the man who lured him into the woods. Your relative? She was silent for a long time, staring at her hands. When she finally looked up, her composed mask had cracked, revealing the grief beneath. My son, she said quietly, Marcus. He would have been 37 in 1987. He died that autumn. Car accident. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook. 3 weeks after that boy went missing. You knew he was involved. Mrs. Holloway nodded slowly. I suspected. Marcus had problems. Issues with impulse control, with boundaries. I'd tried to get him help, but he was an adult. I couldn't force treatment. And Timothy disappeared. I knew, deep down I knew. She pulled a tissue from her desk drawer and dabbed at her eyes. But there was no evidence. No one connected Marcus to the boy, and then he died, and I thought the horror was over. But Timothy's spirit came here. Years later, the gallery began experiencing phenomena. Paintings moving, voices in empty rooms, and then Timothy appeared, trapped in various canvases, always trying to tell his story. I stared at her, pieces clicking together. That's why you need a night curator. Not to watch the art, but to communicate with Timothy, to find someone he can trust enough to show the truth. Mrs. Holloway nodded. The others, the visitor, the figures in the landscapes. They're peaceful spirits who chose to remain. But Timothy was murdered. His soul is anchored here by injustice, by secrets that were never exposed. So why me? Why did he show himself to me? She hesitated, then opened another drawer and withdrew a manila folder, thick with yellowed newspaper clippings. Because you lived on Maple Street in 1987, 3 houses down from Timothy Chen. My blood turned to ice. That's impossible. I would remember. You were 8, the same age as Timothy, the same type, curious boys who rode bicycles and explored where they shouldn't. She spread the clippings across her desk. Marcus had been watching both of you. The headline swam before my eyes. Local boy missing. Search continues for Timothy Chen. Community rallies to find missing child. And there, in one of the photos accompanying the articles, was my own school picture from second grade, part of a collage showing children in Timothy's class. You were his second choice, Mrs. Holloway continued, her voice barely above a whisper. But your parents never let you roam as freely as Timothy did. You were always supervised, always expected home at specific times. Marcus couldn't get you alone. The memory hit me like a physical blow. A man with silver hair approaching me while I played in my front yard, asking about my bicycle, offering to show me something interesting in the woods. My mother calling me inside for dinner before I could respond, her sharp tone suggesting she didn't trust the stranger talking to her son. Came to my house, I whispered. I remember now. My mother, she didn't like him. Your mother likely saved your life. I stared at the newspaper clippings, my hand shaking. Timothy Chen's school picture smiled back at me, gap-toothed and innocent, with no idea what was coming. Below it was another photo, this one of the search parties combing through the woods behind Maple Street. The same woods where I'd found that terrible clearing with its stone marker and the small hand reaching up from disturbed earth. I found his grave, I said suddenly. When I was 8, I rode my bicycle into those woods and found where Marcus buried him. Mrs. Holloway went very still. You saw the burial site? A clearing with a flat stone and fresh earth, and a child's hand. I shuddered at the memory. But when my father went looking the next day, he said there was nothing there. Marcus would have moved the body after you found it. Couldn't risk discovery. Then where is Timothy now? His real body? Mrs. Holloway's expression grew haunted. That's what his spirit has been trying to tell us all these years. Marcus buried him somewhere else, somewhere we've never found. Timothy can't rest until his remains are properly laid to rest. The phone on her desk rang suddenly, making us both jump. Mrs. Holloway glanced at the clock. 6:23 a.m., well past the usual time for supernatural calls. Holloway Gallery, she answered hesitantly. To the receiver, thin and desperate. The boy with the broken bicycle knows where he is. The boy with the broken bicycle has always known. Mrs. Hollow's eyes met mine across the desk. Timothy wants to show you, she said after hanging up. He's been trying to lead you to his final resting place. But the rules were meant to protect previous curators who weren't connected to the case. But you're part of his story. You were supposed to be Marcus's first victim. Timothy chose you specifically because you can handle the truth. I thought of the painting, of Timothy's desperate waving, his mouth forming words I couldn't quite hear. He hadn't been trying to trap me in the canvas. He'd been trying to guide me somewhere. Where? I asked. Where does he want me to go? Mrs. Holloway stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the morning light filtering through the trees. The gallery owns several acres of land, including the woods that border the old neighborhood. Marcus had access to all of it. You think Timothy is buried on your property? I think my son brought him here after moving him from the original site, somewhere he thought no one would ever look. She turned back to me, her winter sky eyes filled with decades of guilt. Will you help him? Will you let Timothy show you where he is? We waited until the next night. Mrs. Holloway stayed late, sitting in her office while I made my rounds. The gallery felt different with her presence, less wild, more controlled, but also sadder, as if the building itself mourned for the secrets it held. The painting had changed again. Now it showed not my childhood backyard, but a path through dense woods. Timothy stood at the beginning of the trail, no longer waving but waiting, his small hands clasped in front of him like a polite child asking for help. At midnight, the visitor emerged from his frame, but instead of taking his usual seat, he approached me directly. You're going to follow the boy, he said. It wasn't a question. Mrs. Holloway thinks it's the only way to give Timothy peace. The visitor nodded slowly. He's grown stronger over the years, more coherent, but also more desperate. Be careful not to lose yourself in his memory. What do you mean? Timothy died violently in terror and pain. Those emotions are part of him now, woven into his very essence. When you enter his world, you'll feel what he felt, see what he saw. Some minds can't handle that kind of trauma secondhand. I looked toward the painting where Timothy waited with endless patience. "What if I don't come back?" "Then you'll join us," the visitor said simply. "There are worse fates than existence within art, but I don't think that will happen. Timothy doesn't want a companion, he wants justice." At 1:13, the visitor returned to his frame, leaving me alone with the decision. I could continue following the rules, making my rounds, collecting my $70 an hour while Timothy remained trapped in his cycle of desperate communication, or I could break the most important rule of all and approach the painting that showed my childhood home. I chose justice. The moment I stepped close to the canvas, the world tilted. The frame expanded, the painted forest becoming real around me. I could smell pine needles and damp earth, could hear the distant sound of wind through branches. Timothy stood before me, no longer a flat painted figure but a real boy, translucent and shimmering like heat waves, but undeniably present. His striped shirt was torn and dirty, his face streaked with tears that would never dry. "Thank you," he said, his voice like the whisper of leaves. "I've been waiting so long for someone to listen." "I'm listening now." He turned and began walking deeper into the woods, following a path that seemed to exist in multiple times at once. Sometimes I saw it as it was now, overgrown and neglected, choked with brambles and fallen branches. Other times I saw it as it had been in 1987, a well-maintained trail that Marcus Holloway had used for his darker purposes. "He was kind at first," Timothy said as we walked. "He fixed my bicycle wheel with a special tool, showed me birds' nests and interesting rocks. I thought he was nice." The path curved around a massive oak tree, and suddenly we were in a different part of the woods entirely. I could see the gallery in the distance, its stone walls gleaming in afternoon sunlight that belonged to another decade. "But then he started asking strange questions," Timothy continued, "about whether my parents would miss me if I didn't come home for dinner, about whether I'd ever wanted to go somewhere far away, where no one could find me." We were moving deeper into the woods now, following a trail that seemed to wind back on itself in impossible ways. The trees grew thicker, older, their branches forming a canopy so dense that very little light penetrated to the forest floor. "I got scared," Timothy said, his voice becoming smaller. "I tried to leave, but he said we were almost there, almost at the special place he wanted to show me, and then..." The path opened into a clearing I recognized, not the one from my childhood memory, but something similar. A circle of ancient trees surrounding a space that felt wrong, tainted by violence and covered with decades of carefully maintained secrecy. In the center of the clearing was a small stone building, little more than a shed with walls made of the same dark rock as the gallery. Marcus's workshop, I realized. The place he'd promised to fix Timothy's bicycle. He said he had special tools inside. But when we went in, the door of the workshop stood slightly ajar, and even from 20 feet away, I could feel the malevolent energy radiating from within. This was where it had happened, where an 8-year-old boy's trust had been shattered along with his life. "I don't need to see inside," I told Timothy. "I believe you." He shook his head. "You need to understand. Need to know how bad it was, so you'll help me make it right, Timothy. Please. I've carried this alone for so long." Against my better judgment, I followed the ghostly child to the workshop door. The interior was small and cramped, filled with tools and workbenches that hadn't been used in decades, but it was clean. Too clean, as if someone had scrubbed away evidence long ago. "He had a rope," Timothy said, his voice breaking, "and a knife, and he told me that if I screamed, he'd use the knife first instead of after." I wanted to leave, to drag Timothy away from this place of horror, but he wasn't finished with his story. "It took a long time," he whispered, "and when it was over, he put me in a wheelbarrow and brought me to the other place, the place where I've been waiting all these years." The workshop faded around us, replaced by another part of the forest. This area was even more remote, hidden by a natural depression in the land that made it invisible unless you were standing directly above it. At the bottom of the depression was a ring of standing stones, not natural formations, but ancient markers placed by people who had understood that some locations held power, dark power. "He said the old stones would keep me safe," Timothy said, his voice now barely audible. "Said I'd sleep better here than in any cemetery." In the center of the stone circle, the earth was slightly sunken, as if something beneath had settled over time. Wildflowers grew there now, white and yellow blooms that seemed to glow with their own inner light. "I'm here," Timothy said, pointing to the flowers. "I've been here all along, just waiting for someone to find me and tell the world what Marcus Holloway did." I knelt beside the sunken earth, my hands hovering just above the wildflowers. Somewhere beneath the roots and soil lay the remains of an 8-year-old boy who had trusted the wrong person on the wrong day. "I'll tell them," I promised. "I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." Timothy smiled for the first time since I'd met him, the expression transforming his ghostly features from tragic to peaceful. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for listening." The forest began to fade around me, colors bleeding away like watercolors in rain. But before the vision disappeared completely, Timothy reached out and touched my hand. His fingers were cold as winter, but his touch carried a message that went deeper than words. Remember and tell the truth." I found myself back in the gallery, standing before the painting of my childhood home. But now the canvas showed something different. The stone circle in the woods, the wildflowers marking an unmarked grave, and Timothy himself, no longer trapped and desperate, but free and finally at peace. Mrs. Holloway was standing beside me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You found him?" she whispered. "After all these years, you found where Marcus put him. The stone circle, about half a mile into your woods." She nodded. "I know the place. Marcus used to go there as a child, and he said it felt special to him. I should have thought." She wiped her eyes with a tissue. "We'll call the police in the morning. Anonymous tip about remains in the woods. Timothy will finally have a proper burial." I looked back at the painting one last time. Timothy was gone now, the canvas showing only the peaceful clearing with its circle of stones and carpet of wildflowers. But I could feel his presence in the gallery. Lighter now, no longer weighted down by secrets and injustice. "What happens to the gallery now?" I asked. "To the other spirits?" "They'll remain, if they choose to. This has been their home for so long." Mrs. Holloway straightened her shoulders, some of her old composure returning. "And the gallery will continue to operate. There are other stories here, other spirits who may need help someday. And my job?" She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. $70 an hour, 5 nights a week. "If you want it." I thought about Timos's peaceful face in those final moments, about the visitors' quiet companionship, about the strange family of spirits who had found refuge in this place of art and memory. "Yes," I said, "I want it." 6 months later, the story made the local news. Remains of missing child found after 36 years. Timothy Chen's bones were discovered by hikers in a remote section of woods owned by the Holloway Private Gallery. Police confirmed the identity through dental records and gave the family closure they'd never thought possible. Mrs. Holloway and I attended the funeral. It was small and private, just family and a few friends who still remembered the bright 8-year-old boy who'd vanished one summer day. But I could feel Timothy there, finally at rest, his story told and his killer's name known to those who mattered. The gallery settled into a new routine after that. The paintings still moved and whispered. The phone still rang with mysterious voices, and the visitors still emerged at midnight for quiet conversation. But the desperate energy that had permeated the place was gone, replaced by something more peaceful. New artwork appeared from time to time, usually pieces that seemed to have histories of their own, spirits attached who needed sanctuary or had stories to tell. Mrs. Holloway welcomed them all with the patient kindness of someone who understood that art and death. I mostly followed the rules, but I'd learned that sometimes breaking them was the only way to find the truth. And in a place where paintings came to life and ghosts told stories through pigment and canvas, truth was often more important than safety. The night shift suited me, $70 an hour to watch over the supernatural and serve as a bridge between the living and the dead. It wasn't the career I'd planned, but it was the one I needed. And sometimes, late at night when the gallery was deep in its otherworldly dreams, I'd walk past the painting that had once shown my childhood home. Now it displayed a simple country scene. Rolling hills under a starlit sky, peaceful and eternal. But if I looked carefully, I could sometimes see a small figure in the distance, a boy in a striped shirt, playing in fields of wildflowers that never wilted, finally free to be the child he'd never had the chance to become. Timothy had found his peace, and in helping him find it, I'd found something I didn't know I'd been searching for. A purpose that mattered, a job that meant something beyond click-through rates and quarterly reports. The gallery had given me more than employment. It had given me a family of lost souls and forgotten stories, a place where the strange and supernatural were not just tolerated, but cherished. And every night, as I placed the key back in the lion's mouth and whispered my thanks to the building that had become my home, I knew I was exactly where I belonged. In the space between memory and art, between the living and the dead, between the questions that haunted us and the answers we desperately needed to find. The gallery liked gratitude, Mrs. Holloway had said, but what it liked even more was justice. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, that was exactly what we gave it.